Can we talk for a minute about how awesome the Turn 1, namesake of our podcast, by the way, is at Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez? It is possibly the best Turn 1 in all of F1. It is incredibly wide. It actively encourages drivers to go around the outside, especially considering the drivers just got done with that little DRS straight. And when I say little, I mean 3/4 of a mile straight at the Mexico GP. It is wider than Monza, wider than Spa and Austria, all other signature turn ones. You had the hometown kid, Checo Perez, get booted out by Leclerc at turn 1 this year. You had the battle between Ricciardo and Hamilton between laps 7 and 11. You had Hamilton Sainz. You had Hamilton Leclerc, basically Hamilton everybody at turn 1. And then finally, you had Norris scooping dirt to get around Ocon on the last couple of laps. What an awesome turn 1.
Yeah, and once again, here in 2023, Turn 1 does not disappoint in Mexico City, and I cannot wait to break this down for you guys.
Welcome to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. Now entering the grid. Here are your hosts, Thomas and Jeremiah.
Welcome back to Turn 1, a Formula One podcast. We're your host, Thomas.
And Jeremiah.
We are using some new recording equipment last week and this week. As you might notice, our format's a little bit different. We also have a live media board that we're trying to use out, so bear with us through any of our technical stuff that we're trying to work out. But this week, of course, we are covering the 2023 Mexican Grand Prix down in Mexico City at the Autodromo Hermanos Rodriguez. I got to add just a little bit of the accent in there to actually say that correctly. But of course, we're going to walk you through the weekend, which Jeremiah is going to handle. We've got our turn 1 breakdown as always, and then we'll get into what the race had to unfold throughout the weekend for. So Jeremiah, what were your weekend observations?
So with it not being a sprint race, sprint race weekend, we had 3 practice sessions finally, which I think we've all been waiting for, and especially the teams. FP1 we saw a lot of technical difficulties. Lando Norris's car was just revving on its own as he exited the pits. Carlos Sainz completely lost his hydraulics, his power steering gone, and tried to make his way back to the pits. We saw some speed from Albon early as he finished in second. Granted, we don't know exactly what everybody else is running, but that's a good start for the weekend. FP2, we saw some rain early on, and we saw some speed from Valtteri and Daniel as they get to the top. That was awesome. Also, for some reason, Max and Valtteri were just battling on the track just because, FP2, practice session, whatever. And finally, FP3, we have a spin from Mr. Pierre Gasly. I like to throw in a little crash or spin or whatever every now and then when we have one.
Was his as cool as Max Verstappen's spins?
No, because Verstappen somehow manages to always get a full 360, which still blows my mind. I don't
and
know
then
how
just
he
keep
does
going
it.
like nothing happened.
Yeah. Magnussen came on the radio comms and said the wheel is not attached properly. There's something going on. He's going to come back to the pits, which you shouldn't really do, because if the FIA catches wind of that, then there is some kind of drawback to that. I'm not exactly sure what that is, but I know that there is a drawback for saying something like that on the radio. We saw Albon and Ricciardo looking quick. We saw them finishing in the top 10, even though, well, actually with FP3, they were running quali runs, so that was a good look for both of them. We'll jump into qualifying for Q1. Randomly at 2 minutes and 30 seconds, we saw everybody bunched up in the pits. It seemed like nobody wanted to be the first person to go out, which I hate when that happens, but
it's
whatever.
That whole, they want rubber on the track and they want to see somebody else take the lines, and so they just wait.
I get it, but you're risking a penalty, so it's just dumb in my eyes. So, after all that waiting, everybody gets out on track. Alonso spins right at the end of qualifying 1. Yellow flag, everybody has to slow down. Everybody's lap is ruined. What do we see come from this? Well, Ocon, Magnussen, Stroll, Sargent out, but in last place, Lando Norris. Yikes. That hurts for Lando. Q2, we saw Oh,
Real
go ahead.
quick, McLaren all the way around. Not a great weekend.
Not especially, we saw better results from the actual race for McLaren, and we'll get into that a little bit later in this episode. But no, man, as far as the overall weekend, it was not a good look for McLaren this week. So for Q2, we saw Gasly, Hulkenberg, Alonso, and Albon Tsunoda all out, which that's rough. Tsunoda, granted, he was out because he didn't set a time at all. They knew that he was going to be taking an engine penalty. So, they just wanted to get him out of Q1 to kind of help him out a little bit. And so more specifically, so that they could help out Ricciardo. Albon's time was deleted. That's why we saw him exiting in Q2, which was rough because, like I said in the previous practice sessions, he looked quick. Leaving Q3 with your finishing order being Leclerc, Sainz, a Ferrari 1-2 front row lockout. Verstappen, Ricciardo coming in fourth. Awesome. Sergio Perez comes out in fifth. Hamilton, Piastri, Russell, and then Bottas and Zhou Guanyu. We saw the Alfa Romeos coming in that 10th and 9th spot. That was awesome.
We had a showing from one of the AlphaTauris. We had a showing from both Alfa Romeos. Both Ferraris obviously getting that front row lockout. And you go into the race and you're like, okay, is this the one where Leclerc can win from pole? Because what was the stat last week? Was it 9 races from pole where Leclerc had not won the race?
Yeah. Well, I mean, how are you going to beat that Red Bull in race pace? But what was funny about this actual particular Q3 session is that both Ferraris were on record in their interviews afterwards talking about how neither one of them expected to have pace coming out onto those final laps. So whenever they found that pace and they were driving around, they were like, "Oh, hold on. I'm quick. I'm going for it." And we saw front row lockout.
Interesting. Before we get into the turn 1 breakdown, I've got a couple of race notes for you. So obviously this is round 20. We are approaching the end of the year, sadly, but there has been quite the fight for every position, I think, behind Max Verstappen.
Pretty much.
And that number 2 spot is still far up for grabs. I mean, Hamilton could get it. The Ferrari of Sainz is a little bit far behind, but I think it's wide open for Hamilton. And then in the constructors, the number 2 spot's still open. I don't know if McLaren at this point can make up the ground between them and Ferrari, but if a lot of things go right for one team and a lot of things go wrong for another team, who knows? This is also the third race of 5 in the Americas, which I found crazy. And I think the announcers actually said it wrong on the broadcast, but there only used to be 3. There was the United States, there was Mexico, and there was Interlagos down in Brazil. But now that you add Miami and Vegas in, you've got 5 on this side of the world, which is crazy.
Which for us, we love because we no longer have to wake up at 6 a.m. to get ourselves ready for a race. And we're sitting there trying to wipe the crunchies out of our eyes, just trying to wake up.
No, now we just have to stay up until 1 a.m. to watch Vegas.
That's annoying, but whatever.
And then finally, as we go through this, the key turns in this race are going to be obviously turn 1, because that's after that huge 3/4 of a mile or so straightaway, which is where 80% of the overtakes happen. And then probably the coolest spectacle part of the track is turns 12 through 14, which is in that stadium. And not a lot of action happens there, but I loved like the drone shots, or I guess maybe they were helicopter shots, every time they would show that full Foro Sol stadium around the chicane with the drivers going through it. Super cool atmosphere. And then another note, the announcers came on and they said this is a one-stop race, and I think Mexico is probably one of only 2 tracks on the F1 calendar that are legit one-stop race contenders. Because that played out in this one for several teams.
Yeah, which is hilarious because we always hear them at the beginning of every single race. This is a one-stop race. It's no. Because by lap 17, they're done, and there's another 40-something laps, so they have to pit again. There's just no way.
Or in this case, 71 laps.
Yeah.
So right before we get started, looking at the grid, Jeremiah covered qualifying, but there was a couple of changes after that. Obviously, Lance Stroll starts in the pit lane on his birthday. So there you go, Lance Stroll. Sargent, Tsunoda both took penalties. Hated that Alonso had to start in 13th. That wasn't as cool. He's having a rough back half of the year. And then you have the front row lockout. And you know what I think that's attributed to for the Ferraris is just the speed of the Mexico track, and how Ferrari the past 3 or 4 seasons has always relied on pure speed to be their advantage.
Well, we saw how they did at Monza, so you had to expect that when you come to a track like Mexico City that you were going to get something similar to the same results, just because of the altitude, which we talked about last time, causes you to have way less drag. So they are able to run those lower packages so that they can get around the corners faster, but without the penalty of having all that drag on the straights.
Okay, you ready to get into the race start and turn one?
Oh, yeah. So we have an amazing start by both Red Bulls as they have a giant leap off the line, climb to the top. Both of them pass signs off the jump, and they go 3 wide into turn one. This is where things get a little bit dicey because we see Perez trying to turn in a little too early. Leclerc with nowhere to go because he has Max on the inside, so there's a collision there. Leclerc takes damage. Perez gets launched into the air, goes flying back onto the track, slaps the track, gets damage on his side pods, damage in the suspension, and he trying to hobbles his way back to the pits. So we see Sainz staying back, trying to get away from the action. Hamilton gets the jump on Ricciardo, which means Ricciardo obviously falls back, but he didn't have a bad start. It was actually a very good start for Ricciardo. Hamilton just had that jump. Russell jumps Piastri on the inside with Piastri not having the best start. We see Hulkenberg with an amazing start as he gets late on the brakes on the inside, flies past. We see him going past Gasly, Zhou Guanyu, and Bottas. He ends up right behind Piastri. We see Zhou Guanyu flying past Bottas, but loses a spot to Hulkenberg, who just goes flying up the middle early. We see Gasly going to the inside of Bottas, so he also flies past him, which means what? Bottas had a rocky start, goes to the outside, loses spots to Hulk, Zhou, and Gasly, and gets caught up in the traffic around the outside, so he has to get on the brakes early. We see Albon going to the inside, getting past Alonso. We see Alonso with a great start, but he's stuck in traffic along the outside again, like I stated with Bottas, so he once again has to get on the brakes early. We see Magnussen with a great start, but as he gets through turn one, turn two, they're getting out of turn three. They go 3 wide, and him and Tsunoda make contact. Both of them get very minor damage. They're able to continue. Great. But Tsunoda flies up the inside, passing Norris and Ocon. That was an amazing start from Tsunoda. I don't know where that came from. We saw Lando Norris slightly held up by Ocon, but then he moves to the inside and gets around him on the end. So we see him advance a spot. Ocon gets stuck in the outside in traffic. Everybody kept trying to take the outside, but I don't think anybody in the back was aware of what was going on with Perez and Leclerc up at the front. So everybody has to get on the brakes early. That's around the outside. We see Logan Sargent playing it very safe as he brakes super early, which fair play. I mean, there's a bunch of carnage going on in front of you. I'm going to stop, Lance Stroll, like we already stated, he starts out in the pits, but he's no longer in last because coming up in last is Perez, who's rejoining the track and actually still continuing at a decent pace. Now, it isn't until he boxes the car at the end of the lap that they find out the amount of damage that he took. And so his race is unfortunately going to be over, which is horrible for all of the Mexican fans that came out to see him.
So Jeremiah, always with the excellent turn one breakdowns. But I want to go back and look at a couple of this, mainly starting with the Perez thing, because that was the front of the pack, the first thing that we saw. Loved the aggression, trying to go 5-1 right out of the gate in the home race. But I talked about it in the open. That turn one, like it entices you to go around the outside because you can get so much speed built up. But I think drivers kind of get themselves in a rocky situation where they pull ahead of the driver that they're wheel to wheel with, right? They get in like a blind spot and they lose sight because the sight line is to the right of where that turn is. They lose sight of when that turn begins and they always turn early. We saw that later on in the race with Yuki Tsunoda when he was trying to run down Oscar Piastri. He actually ran down Piastri, but then turned into him at that turn one because he got slightly ahead of him, didn't realize where the turn was, and then put his wheel in Piastri's wheel well, and then went flying off the track. It was almost identical to the situation that played out with Sergio on the very first lap of the race. Outside of that, you had, I think, aggression everywhere because, I mean, Max off the jump split both Ferraris coming up the middle, like you mentioned. He was going for it. And not to say the Ferraris had a bad start. I think the Red Bulls just had an amazing start. Sainz dropped back, took his place. I think the biggest storyline out of turn one in the early stages of the race, though, Daniel Ricciardo defended so well in that AlphaTauri.
Yes.
Like,
I
for
was
2/3 of the race, he defended really, really well.
I was wondering if you were going to talk about that because I didn't mention it. I was trying to get through the entire list, but the battle between Ricciardo and Hamilton was amazing. As Ricciardo gets the inside for turn one, but as they're going into turn two, now Lewis Hamilton's around the inside and he's trying to go to the outside for turn three, but Ricciardo slams the door on him. Eventually, Hamilton gets past, but wow, dude, that was awesome to see from that AlphaTauri.
So as you come out of the turn one section, which also includes the back-to-backs of turn 2 and 3 right after that, you have a new race order that is Verstappen, Leclerc, Sainz, Hamilton and Hamilton and Ricciardo kind of wheel to wheel at that point, trading spots, and then Russell and Piastri kind of wheel to wheel trading spots. So just a huge shakeup from the Ferrari lockout we had early on. Hamilton kind of playing back. Perez not even in the mix anymore because his race is over. One of the best turn ones I think we've seen this season in terms of action and aggression and changing the race order dramatically.
I think the only thing that bothered me with this turn one is the fact that Leclerc ran off the track into the grass and was able to retake first position. While it was only temporary as Max went speeding past him, I still thought that was weird. Also, a little fun fact there, we see Leclerc going underneath the logos on the grass because those logos aren't actually there. They are computer generated.
He immediately just went through a portal and then shot out the other side. But no, I mean, he knew as soon as he came out in front of Verstappen, he wasn't going to wait for his team to order in to give him back the spot. He just kind of pulled over to the right, let Verstappen fly by.
Right.
Like, that's not your spot. But I did find it interesting that once he ran off the track, he made absolutely no effort to rejoin the track. He just put his wheels straight to the left and cut the grass. Like, no effort to rejoin at all, which is great. Okay, so let's look at some key moments, and this will actually take us through some of the laps of the race. I think the biggest point overall for the day, outside of the hometown Checo Perez being kicked out in lap 1, is Hamilton's climb from where he started in 6th place all the way up to where he finished ultimately in 2nd. He had a battle with literally everyone in the top 10. He fought Ricciardo for a while. He fought Sainz. He fought Leclerc. And all of it, I mean, none of these were like easy passes. Like, he would spend 4 or 5 laps dogfighting somebody. You'd see the little time intervals going from 2 seconds down to 1 second. Then he'd get DRS, and then he'd spend 3 laps with DRS trying to get him. And then he'd get it to 0.2. And then on the very next lap, boom, got it at turn 1. Every single time. Hamilton had a day, and it shows you why he's a 7-time champion.
I do want to make sure that you do mention Lando Norris's amazing drive as he goes from 17th all the way up to where he finishes in 5th.
We're getting there. He had a great day. We've talked about the recovery drive aspect of drivers plenty of times with Sergio Perez. I'm sure Lando's had another recovery drive this season, but just where they are in the standings, it hasn't meant a whole lot. But for him to go from no points to top 5 points, that is a significant swing for McLaren. Would have been better if they had their top 3 performance like they've been having the past 4 or 5 weeks, but we'll get there. Here's what I found interesting between laps 7 and 11. Obviously, this is Daniel Ricciardo's second race back in his AlphaTauri seat since breaking his wrist a couple of months back. I don't know. The AlphaTauri is not a good car. We know the AlphaTauri is not a good car. And not to say that Yuki's underperforming by any means in the AlphaTauri, even though he is. That car is not a top 5 car, yet he treated and got the performance out of that AlphaTauri car like it was a top 4 car for about 35 laps.
Yeah.
It wasn't until the safety car from K-Mag where Ricciardo really kind of started to get back pushed to the 6th, 7th spot in the race, which he also still managed to hang on to. But Hamilton was going at him laps 7 to 11, and like Crofty and Brundle were even like, oh, well, Hamilton's going to get him on this lap. Ricciardo defends again? Like, every single time. I haven't seen that from Hamilton all year. That struggle behind a driver like that.
Makes me excited, especially how much we talked about, or how much you talked about Ricciardo. There's no way he's getting that Red Bull seat. Well, I don't know.
So my only question is, where was this in his first couple of races? Where was this last weekend? Like, why Mexico? Why now?
I think I think the AlphaTauri just had a good car for this track because we saw Yuki Tsunoda making excellent times in the practice sessions. Unfortunately, he's going to start off with that penalty, which kicks him all the way back. So he had to fight his way back up from 18th. But we saw some awesome performance from the AlphaTauris all weekend.
Moving on in the Hamilton storyline, I'm going to jump around to lap 33, where it comes on the radio that Hamilton and Mercedes have agreed to their one-stop push, which I thought was vastly different than the strategy they had last week when they were extremely indecisive on if it was going to be a one-stop or two-stop. You knew that they came into this race with, hey, look, if this works out, this is what we're doing, this is what we're going. There's going to be no on-the-fly decision-making about this.
Good.
And I think that really worked out in Hamilton's favor. George Russell had a mediocre day as always, I think, this year, but I've got one note for him later. Okay, second note on the big things. We covered Hamilton. Ricciardo obviously staying high early. Again, Ricciardo didn't get pushed down to the 6th spot, I want to say, until after that safety car restart, and I could be a little off on my laps there, but he was top 4 for the vast majority of the first half of the race.
Which that bothers me because if there wasn't a red flag and they didn't have the restart, then all the cars wouldn't have been bunched back up together and Ricciardo wouldn't have lost all those positions. So that bummed me out. If they had just kept that spacing that they had before the red flag, then he probably could have stretched that out all the way.
Because he was 5th at the lap 36 restart. So he'd only lost one spot in 35 laps of racing, which is incredible. Obviously, we'll get to the results, but spoiler, if you didn't watch the race or you don't remember where he finished, Ricciardo ended up finishing 7th, which if you're a casual fan, you're like, 7th's not great. But if you know anything about AlphaTauri struggles this season and last, 7th is awesome. 7th is the best day they've had all year from AlphaTauri.
Oh, yeah, easily.
Final big point before we kind of look at maybe some of the funny radio calls or so. Jeremiah called it out. Lando Norris goes 17-5 over the course of 71 laps. The lap 36 restart helped him a little bit, but he was already in 10th by the time the lap 36 restart occurred. So he'd already climbed up 7 spots.
So that's where it gets dicey for me because he went from 17th, climbed his way up to 10th. At that restart, he actually had a bad getaway and fell back down to 14th as he gets passed by 4 different cars on that restart. So he had to work his way back up from 14th, even though he was already at 10th, and goes from 14th all the way up to 5th where he finished.
So I guess I'll hit this here. I made a note after that restart. So after the red flag, they all come out and they do a standing start again, which we love the standing start and we love when there's multiple in a race. And I was all ready to do a whole nother turn 1 breakdown. And they get to turn 1 and everybody played it safe.
Oh, yeah.
Everybody. There was no aggression, no going outside, no dive bombing. Like you mentioned about kind of Norris giving up some spots, some other guys giving up 1 or 2 spots here or there. If it wasn't there, they would just back out of it and let it happen. Which, you know what, fair enough after you see Sergio Perez go flying off the track in his home race in the first 8 seconds of the race. Okay, let's go back through and look at these real quick. Lap 5, they pan over to Sergio in the garage, and he is just devastated. We were so hyped about Checo coming into the Mexican Grand Prix, as we are in every year, because he is probably, maybe Max is loved more by his fans, but in terms of a country loving somebody, I don't think there's any doubt that Mexico loves Sergio more than any other country loves their drivers. He's everything to them.
And with the fact that he's had a podium finish in the last 3 starts at this race, or 3 finishes at this race, that hurt to watch, man. It really did.
And him qualifying 5th, which we really haven't seen a decent qualifying performance from him in a long time.
Yeah.
You're like, and then he gets off the line and goes up. He got into 1st. His car was in the lead at turn 1. He was ahead of Max. He was ahead of Charles at turn 1. And then he crashed into Charles. I did love on lap 13, and this is where if you've got any radio calls, shout them out because I might have missed a few here or there. Lap 13, Max Verstappen is told to watch the curb at turn 3, and he says, our car is not very lovely there. His very nice way of saying this car can't handle that turn like you want it to. Lap 32, K-Mag had the worst 2 laps somebody could have. where he comes out of the end of lap 32 out of that stadium section and is wobbling all over the track, ends up going off the track, kicking up dirt and rocks and rumble strips and all that. And then the announcers kind of leave him, the camera leaves him, and then 30 seconds later, they go back to his car on fire, crumpled into pieces.
When you watch the replay of that, it's where it kind of stinks because he gets up on the curb, and I don't know if he just lost all downforce or if all of a sudden, since he did get just a smidgen airborne there with that going up that curb, the car straightens back out and he's trying to get regripped with it. But once he gets into the grass, it's kind of pointless. He goes barreling towards the wall, slaps the wall, and then we see fire coming out of the back. So he hops out immediately, gets over to the side, and he just sits there on the barrier, just defeated. And I was so upset because we saw Hulkenberg having such a great day, and I wanted to see Magnussen have a great day too, since they brought all of those upgrade packages last weekend.
Possibly my favorite radio call from the entire race happened on lap 43. Sorry, this wasn't even a radio call. This was an announcer statement that I pulled as a quote. Oscar Piastri under pressure from Yuki Tsunoda. In what world are we in where Yuki Tsunoda in his cruddy AlphaTauri car is pressuring Oscar Piastri in a top 3 performing McLaren?
I told you, AlphaTauri looked good this weekend at this track.
And it was a serious battle. Him and Piastri went at it for like 7 laps, until Tsunoda ended up getting thrown off the track in similar fashion to Perez.
Yeah, and then of course, instead of him jumping right back into the race, he slaps the steering wheel and shakes his fist and does what Yuki does, his little firecracker.
It was 100% on Tsunoda, though. He did have a great battle with Oscar. And you know what? If you're going to go out, that's how you're going to go out, competing to hold 7th spot or competing to get 7th place. You know, that's the way to do it. You make a show about it. But he did more egregiously, I think, than Perez did. He hit that turn 1 so early and went straight into Piastri. And when you're on the inside line, it's slower, but the benefit is I think you have the power and the grip advantage, and you're also going slower and more controlled. And so your car doesn't fly off like the car trying to go around the outside does.
Yeah, you're not at the limit.
Let's see. Lap 54, Ocon gets on the radio to his team and he says, "Hey, you guys tell Haas to be ready because I'm going for it." And they're like, "Okay." And then he immediately loses out to Hulkenberg at turn 1. I was like, "All right, Esteban, calm down. You're not doing anything crazy here."
Oh no.
Okay, final radio call. Lap 64, Norris comes on, his team comes on to him, and he says, "We all know what George Russell is like. He's all or nothing. Have patience." What a change from last year when Russell was Mr. Consistency. We've talked about this so many times, but the fact that teams are calling him out on team radio, that we know what he is, he's all or nothing. George, fix your driving style, dude.
Yeah, maybe dial it back just a smidgen there, because we see a lot more patience from Max, and we see how that's going for him. And apparently now George has the reputation of being the man on track that everybody fears.
And not because they fear him like he's going to win the race, because he's going to put other cars in danger, taking himself out of a race. He's going to try to go from 4th to 3rd and take out 3 cars in the process. Okay, so your race finishes, and you have, of course, Max Verstappen. He only won by about 13, 14 seconds. He was so lifting and coasting at the end because there was a time in the race where he had about a 30-second lead with cleared out pit stops and everything. So I think he was kind of taking it easy, and Lewis was really pushing towards the end. But your order goes Verstappen, Hamilton, Leclerc, Sainz, Norris, Russell, the AlphaTauri of Daniel Ricciardo, Oscar Piastri, the Williams in Alex Albon, and then one of the Alpines sneaks into the points, Esteban Ocon. So, Jeremiah, what were your winners and losers from the day?
This one hurts. I'll start with the losers. Sergio Perez, the hometown kid. Kevin Magnussen, the American driver, not or the American team driver, not the actual American driver. Slaps the wall. We see him out. And the one that really breaks my heart, both Aston Martins are my losers. So the team in general. We saw Fernando Alonso take damage earlier, as we assume he had ran over the damage that was caused from Leclerc and Perez. And so we assume that that's what caused him to DNF. They said that he had damage and start cooling off the brakes and bring the car in. Lance Stroll, we see him make contact with, I believe it was Ocon, and that damage unfortunately meant that he also had to retire. And the final one, my final loser, Logan Sargent. And this one sucks because he went 70 laps. And on the 71st lap, he had apparently been nursing this fuel pump issue for the entirety of this back half of the race. And it eventually caught up to him. There was nothing else he could do. They told him, they came on the comms, told him the box, and he was livid. Rightfully so. But unfortunately, he makes the losers list.
You know, a real American would have turned off the car, gotten out, and pushed it the rest of the way.
This isn't the Dallas Grand Prix.
Look, I think it was Nigel Mansell. Somebody passed out on the tarmac. That's what you better be doing when you're representing an entire nation of 300-something million people, kid.
Let me get your losers, and then we'll jump into winners.
Okay, so losers, Sergio's number one. This is his home race. He's podiumed in the past 2 years. He's got to be really the only loser from the day because it's your race, man. And then I'll add one more, which is Charles Leclerc. Not because he had a bad day, he finished third, but the fact that his era of F1 is overlapping, it's going to overlap perfectly with Max Verstappen's career. And that stinks.
Unless Ferrari can start combating with Red Bull at a higher level, we're not going to get to see that battle.
It's like if you're the best golfer, but you're the same age as Tiger Woods, you know, like you're so good. You could have beat any other generation, just not the one you're in.
Nope.
Okay, and then you said winners?
Yeah, for my winners, Daniel Ricciardo. Oh, yeah. As he finishes in 7th place in that AlphaTauri, which is by far and away, I believe, the highest position that they finished all year long. Max Verstappen, for obvious reasons. We're going to mention him in every single race. Lando Norris going from 17th to 5th. From 17th to 10th, back down to 14th, and then finally into 5th. Great race for Lando. Great recovery, especially going out in Q1 and starting all the way down at the back. And my final winner, Alex Albon, as he climbs into the points, manages to go from 14th, fights his way all the way up to 9th.
I like it. Give me Norris as a winner. You know, anytime you can go 17th to 5th is no small feat, even if you are in a top car. Like, even if a Red Bull did that, that's still a pretty big deal because you have to cut your way through so much pack. You have to do so many overtakes. You have to get the strategy right. It's a big deal. And then my only other winner, Daniel Ricciardo. The fact that he qualied 4th and then was able to hold on to 4th for so long. We've seen other teams do this. Like, we've seen, when was it when we saw Zhou qualify in the top 5th and then immediately lose it? We've seen Logan Sargent qualify in the top 10 and then immediately lose it. Like, these bottom tier cars, if they have a really good quality performance, they struggle on the first lap to maintain it. Daniel Ricciardo got out of lap 1, got out of lap 2, got out of the next 35 laps holding top 5. And then you finish in the 7th place position. That is the only way to do it as a lower team. You know, if you're in the bottom 3 or 4 teams, that's the only way to do it.
I mean, it's one of those things where if you really look at who finished in front of him or who started in front of him, Verstappen, Red Bull, and both Ferraris. So who was behind him? Red Bull, both Mercedes, both McLarens. He had the Alpines behind him. All of those cars are going to beat the AlphaTauri on any other given race, on any other given day. And like you said, we see some of these backmarker cars, like we'll see a Hulkenberg starting in 7th, and then he'll eventually end up in 17th or 16th where he belongs. And so when you see Ricciardo able to defend his way for 71 laps to keeping points, but not just keeping points, 7th, not like 9th, not like 10th. He finished 7th. Anytime you see something like that, it's incredible.
All right. Let us know, will Lewis Hamilton be able to overtake Sergio Perez in the drivers for 2nd place before we get to the end of Abu Dhabi this year?
And more important than that, will Ferrari get rid of Charles Leclerc and put Daniel Ricciardo back behind the wheel?
All right, guys. We'll see you.
Bye, guys.